I was checking in with one of our college students who grew up at Bethel this week, who's a senior. And I asked, how was senior year in college? And they were struggling because this experience, their last year at university, is so different from what they had experienced before. And I was checking in with one of our children, no longer children, young adults who grew up at Bethel, who was a freshman in college. And I said, what's life like on campus? And they said, it's amazing. College is great. And I couldn't help but chuckle because they had nothing else to compare it to. And so for them, this experience is what college is. They didn't have a pre-pandemic college experience to realize what they may be missing out on. That same student who was born after September 11th and doesn't know what this world was like before that moment. I think about that generation, those born after September 11th, where the only world that they know is one in which America has always been at war with multiple countries, in which there's profound heartache, Islamophobia, and bigotry. I think about the generation following the Vietnam War of young men who suffered from PTSD for most of their lives. Many of you continue to do so. And so many who lost loved ones as a result of that war. I think about that after effect, that ripple effect, the consequences that we can't really ever prepare for, the consequences of the experience of the moment. And I think about that as we read our Parsha this morning. For Parashat Noach begins, Ele toldot Noach, Noach ish sadik tamim haya bedorotav, et ha'elohim hitalech Noach. Noah walked with God, it says. That these are the generations, the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous person, quiet, simple, blameless for his time, and he walked with God. Midrash wonders about this beginning of our Parsha. Midrash Tanhuma asks, why is Noah's name mentioned 3 separate times in the first 2 verses of the Parsha? Noach, Ele toldot Noach. Noach ish sadik tamim haya bedorotav. Noach, et ha'elohim hitalech Noach. 3 times. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous person. Noah walked with God. Why do we need his name again and again and again, Midrash Tanhuma asks? And it answers its own question. The text says that Noah experienced 3 separate worlds. The world pre-flood, the world of the flood, and the world after the flood. And as a result, there were actually 3 separate Noahs. The Noah who lived a life before the world was destroyed. The Noah who experienced so much pain and suffering and destruction. And the Noah after that, who didn't quite know what to do with what he experienced before. In some ways, it's easy for that freshman to go off to college who didn't experience what college was like before. The 18, 19-year-old doesn't know what life was like pre-9/11, how security is so much more extreme, how we all have constantly been on the edge of our seats for 2 decades. Noah, he knew what life was like. There's a midrash that said that his children had children on the ark, and they loved experiencing dry lands. But that was their first opportunity to appreciate lands. But Noah, he knew what the world was like. He knew what he had missed. That first Noah, that pre-flood Noah, was a righteous person, we're told. Noach ish tzaddik. But the Talmud debates how righteous he actually was. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah argue, what does it mean he was righteous for his generation? Was he righteous and graded on a bell curve only in comparison to those around him who we know were wicked? Or, in Abraham's generation, would he have been not so righteous? Or all the more so, was it so much harder to be righteous when everybody around him was not? Would he have been even more righteous in a different time in history? There was the Noah, the pre-flood, who tried his best to do what was right when everyone around him wasn't. There was the Noah, who would stand motionless on the deck of the ark as it rocked back and forth on steady tides, watching the torrential downpours wipe away all tree and plants and living creature and human being, feeling helpless and hopeless and guilty, unable to do anything to save the lives of those who are not on that safe haven of an ark. All he could do was simply bear witness to tragedy, to destruction. And then there was the Noah post-flood. That Noah departs onto dry land and immediately offers a sacrifice of one of the animals he kept safe to God. But the Torah tells us that Noah ends up getting drunk, getting naked, exposing himself. It's like he hit rock bottom, has a sense of survivor's guilt. He doesn't know how to live in that post-flood world after experiencing so much destruction, so much loss. That post-flood world was different, and he wasn't sure how to live in that world. He wasn't sure how to keep going, even if he had to. For many of us, we feel like we are that second Noah, standing on the deck of the ark, watching as society is being destroyed, so much more so than 40 days and 40 nights. We are dealing with so many floods right now. The flood of a 7+ month pandemic, where we've witnessed so much unnecessary loss. The flood of centuries-old racism that is sown into the fabric of our nation that only now are we confronting for the first time since the Civil Rights Movement. The flood of 4 years of a presidential administration that has condoned and amplified voices of hate and bigotry and bullying. It's like the driving rain is hitting us in the face. No matter where we hold our umbrellas, we keep getting wet. And when we feel a moment of calm, when we think the flood is over, we see news that this third wave, the virus, is beginning. It's as if we were just stuck in the eye of the hurricane, calm for a moment, but tricked until we realize that the torrential downpour continues. So the question for all of us, not knowing actually when this flood, these many floods will end, how will we respond after the flood? How will we pick up the pieces once we see that dove with an olive branch in its mouth and realize that this world is actually far from peaceful, a world so broken? How will we be an ish tzaddik or an isha tzadeket, as Noah was called, a righteous person, instead of doing what he ends up doing and spiraling downward? The world is forever different. Just as I said about that post-war generation, that post-9/11 generation, all of us are forever changed by the experiences over these past many months. And those pandemic babies, those who have been born during this outbreak of coronavirus, We'll experience a world that's so different than any of us remember. How do we put the pieces back together differently than before and turn the shards of brokenness into something whole, making the world more perfect than it was, building a new Gan Eden? Midrash Tanchuma again asks another question. What does it mean that Noah walked with God? Why wouldn't he follow God? Why would he walk with, suggesting that he was actually side by side with the Holy One? And it offers an allegory that if a sovereign's child is going on a journey and is forced to travel upon a road that is thick with mud, then that king or queen will support that child along the way, lest they get stuck in the sludge, in the muck. Noah walking with God means actually that God held Noah up. Noah kept getting stuck, and God made Noah unstuck. God kept pushing Noah along the road, along the journey. He was destined to fall into that metaphoric mud, into that world after the flood. God helped him keep going. So we really have each of these Noahs, each of these descriptions represents Noah in each of these worlds. The righteous Noah and Ish Sadiq was that pre-flood Noah. That Noah who was Tamim, who was simple, who was motionless, who didn't do anything. That was the Noah who sat in the ark and watched the world destroyed. And the Noah who walked with God. That was the Noah post-flood, because that was when he needed God the most, to carry him, to buttress him, to support him, to help him keep going. I think this is when we need God the most too. And when this pandemic eventually subsides, when, God willing, soon there is a vaccine, when lockdowns will be over and it'll be safe to return to normalcy, understanding actually that it's a different Noah than the Noah that was before. So the normalcy of post-pandemic will never be the same as pre-pandemic. Our world is forever altered. But when we can return, we'll need God to support us in order to do so. Because we're all destined to fall and fail and get stuck in the mud. It's what our instincts tell us. For many of you, myself included, we may be eating more or drinking far too much. We may be sleeping less as insomnia hits. We have fears of this pandemic getting worse. We have fears of November 3rd. We have fears of November 4th, 5th, and 6th. And we're not taking care of our bodies and of our souls. But once we can exit off of this ark and touch dry land again, may we walk with God. May God hold us up to help us build a better world, a more just world than we had experienced before. I believe in some ways calling Noah an Ish Sadiq, a righteous person, was a test, much like God tested Abraham. How would Noah respond? It's easy to be righteous before you've experienced pain and loss and destruction. How will he respond as a righteous person after the fact? How will we respond after the fact as well? We are each three different people. The person who we were before March, the person who we are now, and the person who we will be after this pandemic is over. The reality and the question of what do we do next, of what will the third version of ourselves be like, is an answer that we do not yet have. We don't know what our post-flood reality will look like, what this world that we will build together will be. But I pray that God holds us all up so that when we build this world, a world that will care about the safety and well-being of all, a world that when we see that rainbow arc in the sky, we're reminded of God's love and God's promise to all of us and our promise to each other. That we will rebuild a world that is better than before, more just, more empathetic, more kind and compassionate. A world built on love. Amen.